can hardly be conceived. In lieu of whip he carried in his hand a great gold-headed cane, as large as any footman carries in these days, and his various modes of holding this unwieldy weapon, now upright before his face like the sabre of a horse soldier, now over his shoulder like a musket, now between his finger and thumb, but always in some uncouth and awkward fashion, contributed in no small degree to the absurdity of his appearance. Stiff, lank, and solemn, dressed in an unusual manner, and ostentatiously exhibiting, whether by design or accident, all his peculiarities of carriage, gesture, and conduct, all the qualities, natural and artificial, in which he differed from other men, he might have moved the sternest looker-on to laughter, and fully provoked the smiles and whispered jests which greeted his departure from the Maypole Inn. Quite unconscious, however, of the effect he produced, he trotted on beside his secretary, talking to himself nearly all the way, until they came within a mile or two of London, when now and then some passenger went by who knew him by sight and pointed him out to some one else, and perhaps stood looking after him, or cried, in jest or earnest as it might be, "Hurrah, Geordie! No popery!" at which he would gravely pull off his hat and bow. When they reached the town and rode along the streets, these notices became more frequent. Some laughed, some hissed, some turned their heads and smiled, some wondered who he was, some ran along the pavement by his side and cheered. When this happened, in a crush of carts and chairs and coaches, he would make a dead stop, and pulling off his hat, cry, "Gentlemen, no popery!" to which the gentlemen would respond with lusty voices, and with 3 times 3. And then on he would go again, with a score or so of the raggedest following at his horse's heels, and shouting till their throats were parched. The old ladies, too, there were a great many old ladies in the streets, and these all knew him. Some of them, not those of the highest rank, but such as sold fruit from baskets and carried burdens, clapped their shrivelled hands, and raised a wheezing, piping, shrill "Hurrah, my lord!" Others waved their hands or handkerchiefs, or shook their fans or parasols, or threw up windows, and called in haste to those within to come and see. All these marks of popular esteem he received with profound gravity and respect, bowing very low, and so frequently that his hat was more off his head than on, and looking up at the houses as he passed along with the air of one who was making a public entry, and yet was not puffed up or proud. So they rode, to the deep and unspeakable disgust of John Gruby, the whole length of Whitechapel, Leadenhall Street, and Cheapside, and into St. Paul's Churchyard. Arriving close to the cathedral, he halted, spoke to Gashford, and looking upward at its lofty dome, shook his head, as though he said, "The church in danger." Then, to be sure, the bystanders stretched their throats indeed, and he went on again with mighty acclamations from the mob, and lower bows than ever. So along the Strand, up Swallow Street, into the Oxford Road, and thence to his house in Welbeck Street, near Cavendish Square, whither he was attended by a few dozen idlers, of whom he took leave on the steps with this brief parting: "Gentlemen, no popery. Good day. God bless you." This, being rather a shorter address than they expected, was received with some displeasure, and cries of "A speech! A speech!" which might have been complied with, but that John Gruby, making a mad charge upon them with all 3 horses, on his way to the stables, caused them to disperse into the adjoining fields, where they presently fell to pitch and toss, chuck farthing, odd or even, dog fighting, and other Protestant recreations. In the afternoon Lord George came forth again, dressed in a black velvet coat, and trousers and waistcoat of the Gordon plaid, all of the same Quaker cut; and in this costume, which made him look a dozen times more strange and singular than before, went down on foot to Westminster. Gashford, meanwhile, bestirred himself in business matters, with which he was still engaged, when shortly after dusk John Gruby entered and announced a visitor. "Let him come in," said Gashford. "Here, come in," growled John to somebody without. "You're a Protestant, ain't you?" "I should think so," replied a deep, gruff voice. "You've the looks of it," said John Gruby. "I'd have known you for one anywhere." With which remark he gave the visitor admission, retired, and shut the door. The man who now confronted Gashford was a squat, thick-set personage, with a low retreating forehead, a coarse shock head of hair, and eyes so small and near together that his broken nose alone seemed to prevent their meeting and fusing into one of the usual size. A dingy handkerchief, twisted like a cord about his neck, left its great veins exposed to view, and they were swollen and starting, as though with gulping down strong passions, malice, and ill will. His dress was of threadbare velveteen, a faded, rusty, whitened black, like the ashes of a pipe or a coal-fire after a day's extinction, discoloured with the soils of many a stale debauch, and reeking yet with pot-house odours. In lieu of buckles at his knees he wore unequal loops of pack-thread, and in his grimy hands he held a knotted stick, the knob of which was carved into a rough likeness of his own vile face. Such was the visitor who doffed his three-cornered hat in Gashford's presence, and waited leering for his notice. "Ah, Dennis!" cried the secretary. "Sit down." "I see my lord down yonder," cried the man, with a jerk of his thumb towards the quarter that he spoke of. "And he says to me, says my lord, 'If you've nothing to do, Dennis, go up to my house and talk with Muster Gashford.' Of course I'd nothing to do, you know. These an't my working hours. I was a-taking the air when I see my lord, that's what I was doing. I takes the air by night, as the howls does, Muster Gashford." "And sometimes in the daytime, eh?" said the secretary. "When you go out in state, you know." "Ha, ha!" roared the fellow, smiting his leg. "For a gentleman as'll say a pleasant thing in a pleasant way, give me Muster Gashford agin all London and Westminster. My lord ain't a bad un at that, but he's a fool to you. Ah, to be sure, when I go out in state." "And have your carriage," said the secretary, "and your chaplain, eh, and all the rest of it?" "You will be the death of me," cried Dennis, with another roar. "You will. But what's in the wind now, Muster Gashford?" he asked hoarsely. "Eh? Are we to be under orders to pull down one of them popish chapels, or what?" "Hush!" said the secretary, suffering the faintest smile to play upon his face. "Hush! God bless me, Dennis, we associate, you know, for strictly peaceable and lawful purposes." "I know, bless you," returned the man, thrusting his tongue into his cheek. "I entered a purpose, didn't I?" "No doubt," said Gashford, smiling as before. And when he said so, Dennis roared again and smote his leg still harder, and falling into fits of laughter wiped his eyes with the corner of his neckerchief and cried, "Muster Gashford agin all England hollow!" "Lord George and I were talking of you last night," said Gashford, after a pause. "He says you are a very earnest fellow." "So I am," returned the hangman. "And that you truly hate the Papists." "So I do." And he confirmed it with a good round oath. "Look ye here, Muster Gashford," said the fellow, laying his hat and stick upon the floor, and slowly beating the palm of one hand with the fingers of the other. "Observe. I'm a constitutional officer that works for my living, and does my work creditable. Do I, or do I not?" "Unquestionably." "Very good. Stop a minute. My work is sound, Protestant, constitutional English work. Is it, or is it not?" "No man alive can doubt it." "Nor dead neither. Parliament says this here, says Parliament, if any man, woman, or child does anything which goes agin a certain number of our acts—" "How many hanging laws may there be at this present time, Muster Gashford? 50? "I don't exactly know how many," replied Gashford, leaning back in his chair and yawning. "A great number, though." "We'll say 50. Parliament says if any man, woman, or child does anything agin any one of them 50 acts, that man, woman, or child shall be worked off by Dennis. George the Third steps in, when they number very strong at the end of a sessions, and says, 'These are too many for Dennis. I'll have half for myself, and Dennis shall have half for himself.' And sometimes he throws me in one over that I don't expect, as he did 3 year ago, when I got Mary Jones, a young woman of 19, who come up to Tyburn with a infant at her breast, and was worked off for taking a piece of cloth off the counter of a shop in Ludgate Hill, and putting it down again when the shopman see her, and who had never done any harm before, and only tried to do that in consequence of her husband having been pressed 3 weeks previous, and she being left to beg with 2 young children, as was proved upon the trial. Ha, ha! Well, that being the law and the practice of England is the glory of England, an't it, Muster Gashford?" "Certainly," said the secretary. "And in times to come," pursued the hangman, "if our grandsons should think of their grandfathers' times and find these things altered, they'll say those were days indeed, and we've been going downhill ever since. Won't they, Muster Gashford?" "I have no doubt they will," said the secretary. "Well then, look here," said the hangman, If these Papists gets into power, and begins to boil and roast instead of hang,